Support for this program comes from Hyperion Books for Children and Pigs Make Me Sneeze, the 10th installment in the Elephant and Piggy Early Reader series from author and illustrator Mo Willems. There are more of Mo's books online at pigeonpresents.com.
This is Mid-Morning on Minnesota Public Radio. I'm Carrie Miller. This hour, the mysteries and myths of what make teenagers tick. You can still find the video on YouTube, the deeply disturbing pictures taken on a cell phone of a 16-year-old Chicago teen being beaten to death in the midst of a violent brawl. Now, some will see that video and attribute it to social problems in Chicago with race and class and poverty. Others will chalk it up to the emotional problems, lack of impulse control, and absence of judgment that we tend to attribute to teens. Indeed, in the last several years, it's become accepted science that the adolescent brain is a half-developed and mysterious organ that prompts teenagers to behave irresponsibly, incompetently, sometimes violently. Our guest doesn't buy it. Robert Epstein, a psychologist, author, and former editor-in-chief of Psychology Today, believes it's not so much the differences in their brains that's driving teen behavior, but the fact that teens live in an extended adolescence. Dr. Epstein wrote several years ago in a science journal, "The turmoil we see among teens in the U.S. is the result of what I call artificial extension of childhood. Over the past century, we have increasingly infantilized our young, treating older and older people as children, while also isolating them from adults." We're going to talk about that today, and Dr. Epstein's rather interesting views about work and education for teens. He's currently a visiting scholar at the University of California, San Diego, the author of several books, including the forthcoming Teen 2.0. And he's with me in the studio. Good to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Let me try to clarify some of the science around what you believe and about teen behavior. You're not disagreeing with the idea that teenage brains are different from adult brains because, of course, they're still developing. That you do not dispute?
Well, of course not. I mean, a 20-year-old's brain is different from a 40-year-old's, which is different from an 80-year-old's. I mean, the brain changes throughout our life. That's not the issue. Never has been the issue.
Where have we gone wrong, then, in our assessments of what's going on with the teenage brain?
Well, first of all, we have to look at where that idea comes from and whose interests it serves. That's kind of important. The other thing we have to look at, and I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, is we have to look at teens in other cultures. Mm-hmm. That's really important. Now, whose interests are served by saying that the peculiar behavior we see among our teens, obviously some irresponsible behavior, obviously some incompetence, whose interests are served by blaming it on their brains?
I have a feeling we're going towards the drug companies here.
Well, absolutely. And I've done consulting for major drug companies, and I can tell you, I've been in some closed-door meetings, and I can tell you this is exactly how the marketing execs at the big drug companies think.
Are they driving the beliefs, the conventional wisdom about teenage brains, or is some of the science driving that, and they're taking it, 4 steps beyond what scientists really know? See what I'm asking?
The science is not driving it. There are a couple of scientists, it's a very small number, who kind of misinterpret their data because, they get more grant money that way. But they're not really the ones who are the problems. The problem really is the drug companies. The drug companies, we know our teens are in turmoil. We have nearly 40% of our teens have been treated for major depression in the past year. Mm-hmm. Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death. We have 7 million teen gamblers, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on. So we know that teens are in turmoil in this country. The drug companies want us to believe that their brain is the problem so that we will put them on drugs.
Medicated.
Yes. Now, as of 2004, we passed a milestone, which I think is just, it's horrific. It's horrific. And I say that as a parent. As of 2004, we were at that point, and are still doing this, prescribing more psychoactive drugs for teens than all other prescription drugs combined, and that includes antibiotics and acne medication. So in other words, you put that message out over and over and over again through headlines, and that's how they do it. And parents get this message, aha, the brain is defective. I can correct this with drugs.
When you say that's how they do it, I mean, again, my impression is that there is research being done. We've got newer imaging technology. Researchers are learning more about all of our brains, including the teenage brain. That gets into the media. Where's the drug company come into it? I mean, they're not the ones putting out the headlines, are they?
Well, the drug companies, they influence things in very, very subtle ways, because they're the ones, for example, who are involved through the medical schools in a lot of training for people who end up doing the research. They do put out their own press releases.
Well, yes, but
in very, very large numbers.
But the Washington Post is not going to take a press release and put it on the front page. They're going to do their own reporting on it.
Yes, I know the folks at the Washington Post who do this kind of reporting. All I can say is that the science is not really the problem, because the scientific studies are all correlational. All they show you is teen brains are a little different, and then that gets tied into cultural stereotypes about teens. So this connection is made about a causal link between, a difference in a brain and what it's doing causally. There is nothing in the research, not one tiny iota of evidence that would justify drawing a causal link between properties of a teen brain and the problems that we see.
Let me ask you about that when it comes to impulse control, because again, I thought that the research and the imaging technology supports the idea that as the teenage brain is developing, those areas that control impulsive behavior are not as highly developed as they are in somebody my age. You're saying not true.
I'm saying the science is not the problem. Now, for example,
but don't give me the general answer. Tell me whether that's true.
Well, it is and it isn't. For example, a very recent study, I wrote about this for Scientific American just a couple of weeks ago, a very recent study done by Gregory Burns and his colleagues at Emory University, actually shows that white matter in the brain, in the teen brain, develops earlier for teens who seek danger than for teens who don't. So in other words, they have signs in their brain of maturity, what we usually would say that's a sign of a mature brain, that more mild-mannered teens do not. That's the exact opposite kind of correlation as the one people usually point to. So, see, correlations, as we teach in elementary statistics, as I teach, have no implication for causation. They don't tell you anything about causation. So these correlations themselves don't really mean anything, because, again, the brain keeps changing throughout our lives. I mean, are you going to blame differences in the way 40-year-olds behave compared to 30-year-olds on the fact that their brains are different?
No, we don't tend to do that.
No, we tend not to do it. So, but we do it with teens because it ties in with cultural stereotypes. It ties in with things we already believe strongly.
Let me ask you about violence, because I introduced our conversation here with some of the analysis that is coming out of what went on in Chicago, this violent brawl that happened. And there were people right away in the media who were saying, you can trace some of the violent behavior back to the way teens' brains are developing and the attitudes that they have and impulse control and that kind of thing. Again, you would see no link there. There is no science behind that. In
fact, I was on Bill O'Reilly's show on Fox, and he brought up exactly the same issue, and he showed a videotape of violent teens, and he says, "Doesn't this show blah blah blah?" Absolutely, positively not. First of all, young people who do violent things very often are emulating adults, especially gangs. Gangs are emulating armies and governments, and they have emblems, and they have ranks, and they have codes of honor. They're emulating adults. They're not allowed to function as adults, so they kind of, in their own little world, I mean, they do what they can do that's adult-like, including extremely violent things at times. Now, to put this really into perspective, though, which we haven't talked about, you really get perspective on this when you start to look at teens in other cultures. The whole your thinking about this issue changes completely.
How so?
This is what happened to me, by the way, because I didn't know any of these things when I started researching this about 13, 14 years ago. And I was just fascinated by the fact that my second son, Justin, was very mature. He was much more mature than his older brother. In some ways, he was more mature than I was when he was 13, 14 years old. And I recognized that.
In what way?
Oh, the way he could balance kind of hard work with hard play. He could do risky things, but then he could just forego the risky things in order to get his schoolwork done, whatever it was. He was doing business things at that age. And I began to wonder why he was stuck in high school. Why couldn't he drive? Why was I searching his room all the time? And when you start to look at teens around the world, everything changes. Because in more than 100 cultures around the world, there is no teen turmoil. None. There's no conflict with parents. There's no drug abuse. There's no depression. There's no suicide. Nothing. There's no teen turmoil whatsoever. More than 100 cultures around the world don't even have a word for adolescence. Now, if teen turmoil were an inevitable consequence of properties of the developing brain, wouldn't we see it everywhere?
Are you saying that we will find this in Western cultures? Because these beliefs are in the culture in Europe. I know. I was just overseas, and there was an article in The Guardian.
But less so than here. Less so than here.
About teen problems.
Oh, no. I've actually worked out the details on this. And as I say, I've learned so much. My own views have changed. Any culture that severs the connection between young people and older people creates this problem. In other words, if you isolate young people from adults and you trap them, as we have done, in this peculiar world of their own where they learn everything they know from each other, and of course in our culture, everything they know comes from divisions of the media and fashion industries. If you do that, you isolate them from adults, and then if you treat them as if they are still children, which really makes some of them very angry and depressed, you create adolescence.
Hold that thought. Let me remind our listeners about what we're talking about today. Robert Epstein is with us this morning. He's a visiting scholar at the University of California, San Diego, former editor-in-chief of Psychology Today. And if you've been listening in to the conversation, you know he has some interesting views about adolescent brains, adolescent acting out. Why do we perceive the way teenagers and adolescents behave? How different is it here than it is in other parts, other cultures of the world? We're talking about all of that, and we're talking about where the science is on this as well. 800-242-2828 to join us this morning in the metro area, 651-227-6000. If you're online this morning, nprnewsq.org. Click on Send Us a Question. The numbers again, if you're in the metro, 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828. And streaming us at work or at home this morning, nprnewsq.org. Click on Send Us a Question. Let me come back to what you were saying, this idea of isolating teens away from adults to where you're saying they learn a lot of their behavior from each other. Why is there a perception that they're isolated? I mean, as far as I know, many American teens are being raised in households with at least one adult. Where's the isolation come from?
They actually have almost no meaningful contact with adults here. In fact, according to research, teens in the United States spend about 70 hours a week, that's most of their waking hours, in contact with their peers. You compare
that... Is that because they're in school? I mean,
No, school is a big chunk of it, but the other part is electronic communication or hanging out or, that kind of thing. They spend, on average, a half an hour a week with their dads, on average, 15 minutes of which is spent watching television. Now, compare that to cultures where the child-adult continuum, as it's called, is still intact. In those cultures, many of which are developing nations, teens spend on average 5 hours a week with their peers versus 70 here. Who are they spending their time with? They're spending most of their time with usually same-sex adults learning to become adults. That's really what the teen years were through most of human history, even in the West. It was a time in which you learn to become an adult.
Won't parents say, I'd love to spend more time with my teenager. I can't get them interested in doing that. All they want to do is be with their friends.
But again, they're kind of brainwashed. Remember, they're
parents or the kids?
Well, everyone is. Everyone is. The parents know very little about their offspring. They're not kids, by the way, after puberty.
Young people.
A kid is a goat. Until it reaches puberty.
Gotcha.
And
Dr. Epstein,
yeah,
the young people. Won't the parents say, I'd love it if our teenagers would spend more time with us, do things with us. I can't get them interested in doing that.
Well, but see, again, that's giving in. That's saying, okay, we're stuck with this lousy system and, there's nothing we can do. And that is not true. We have to really examine the systems that created the problem, and we have to begin to change these systems. They're horrible systems. The pain that is created by this period of life we call adolescence, the pain is horrific pain. I don't know if you have kids or have teenagers, but I mean, I've been through it. I still have younger ones, so I'm going to have to go through it again. But, the pain is horrible, where you have this precious little creature, and he or she is precious, 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 and then all of a sudden, there's this nightmare living in your home, and you can't understand it. And parents go through such agony during these years, and the young people do too. And sometimes that relationship, that adversarial relationship, persists into adulthood, and sometimes it never, ever ends.
800-242-2828, 651-2276,000, nprnewsq.org. If you're streaming us this morning at work or at home, click on Send Us a Question to the phones to Jeffrey in Stillwater. Hi, Jeffrey.
Good morning. Great topic. How are you?
What's your view of this?
Well, as a psychotherapist who works with adolescent males, I have a couple of questions. And I want to start with a proverb, which is African, which goes way back, which is, if you don't invite the youth to the dance, they'll burn down the village. Mm-hmm. Which supports the view that we need to connect with our children to our adults. But I'm curious about rites of passage, what we can do in this culture, because they're really inefficient, but tribal and older cultures, traditional cultures, which don't have these issues, have a lot of rites of passage. And also, are you supporting really a sociological view? This is a social issue that needs to be addressed, even though it's between individual kids and adults. And what can parents do?
Now that's really interesting, the rite of passage idea, because in the other cultures, it's the adults leading them through those rites of passage.
Yes, well, we have rites of passage here, Jeff, of course, but they no longer mean anything. We still have them. I mean, I'm Jewish. I had a bar mitzvah, for example. Now you are a man. Oh, sure. I mean, is the rabbi, crossing his fingers behind his back? I mean, now you are a man, because it's just not true anymore. But in Africa, where my sister lived in, I think, 5 or 6 countries for many years, it's real. Those rites of passage actually bring you into the adult world, and from that moment on, you are an adult and you work side by side with adults. And again, there is no adolescence. That's right. You don't burn the village down. You become part of it, in a meaningful way. Now, we have rites of passage here, but they don't mean anything. So that's the question. And your last question was, what can parents do? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm actually working on a new book. Beyond the Teen 2.0 book has a big section in it, which is called Finding the Inner Adult in Your Teen. So I'm moving in that direction, but I'm actually working on a whole book that's going to be just for parents, just focusing on this issue. The thing is, there are things you can do as a parent, but they're limited. They're limited because of these larger systems that have been put into place.
I wanted to come back to this. What do you mean when you say systems? Educational system, what?
Well, again, this is something I trace in the Teen 2.0 book, and it was so eye-opening for me. We have systems in place, 3 big ones and then a bunch of smaller ones, but we have the education system with compulsory education laws, where we set up schools that were modeled after the new factories. They all started late 1800s, early 1900s. We were going to educate the masses by the millions. What we ended up doing was trapping young people together with each other who had never before been trapped with each other, because that's not how they got their schooling. Mm-hmm. And we put them in school whether or not they were ready to learn. It didn't matter. The first compulsory education law in the United States was Massachusetts, 1852. It was a competency-based law, meaning if you knew the material, you didn't have to go to school.
Well, are you heading toward, here's some idea that young people should not be going to school?
Well, again, see, there's what parents can do, which is limited. I mean, if you have the resources, for example, you can homeschool, which I think is something we all need to take very seriously. And by the way, Minnesota does more homeschooling than any other state.
So you're recommending more homeschooling?
Well, it's one way. Anything you can do to restore the child-adult continuum, to get young people into meaningful contact with responsible adults.
What about teachers?
There isn't much contact there. That's the problem. You have one teacher and 25 or 30 students. There's really, I mean, my 11-year-old right now had a little problem on a test. He's in middle school. I said, can you make an appointment with your teacher? He's been trying for 2 weeks. He can't do it because she has 200 students over the course of the day.
But somehow young people, if it isn't going to be homeschooling, have to be educated. So what's the answer?
Well, and there are different areas here. Education is one area. Education is an area where big changes are starting to happen now. I'm actually working on an article now which I call "The Future of Education is in My Kitchen," because my 4-year-old is learning to read rapidly with this amazing system called Headsprout online, all in the kitchen, on the kitchen Mac. I mean, it's amazing, and she loves it. She begs to get on the computer every day so she can get back to all her crazy animals, and she's learning to read much faster than any of my other kids did.
I want you to be clear here. What you're saying about schooling. I mean, are you here to say this morning that we don't really need the kind of education system that we've got because we've got young people in too much contact with themselves and not with adults?
Well, the factory system of education is going to die. It made sense 100 years ago when you had literally hundreds of thousands of new immigrants on the streets and you had to get them off the streets and you had to Americanize them and so on. It doesn't make sense anymore. Education needs to be spread out over one's life. It no longer makes sense to try to cram it all into the early years. By the time you're out of school, most of what you've learned is, passé. So education needs to be spread out over one's life, and it needs to be personalized and individualized. The classroom is a horrible place for learning to take place, and the tools for being able to spread education out over one's life and to be able to personalize it, individualize it, we're building those tools right now. The main tool being the internet and some really, really good programming that's coming along. So that takes care of education. That's going to move in that direction, believe it or not. It really is. I mean, as I say, the future of education is in your kitchen. So
let me go back to the phones here because we have full lines.
Sure.
We can always come back to this. To Sharon in St. Paul. Hi, Sharon. Thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I raised my daughter from the time she was a young child, as a single parent. And there was no choice for me. I didn't have lots of money. I couldn't indulge her in lots of things that I maybe wished I could have. Choices that I made for us were my choices, although they took into account, something for her. They were my choices to make, and she had to come along. And I think because of that, she grew up as a responsible person. She had to share in household responsibilities, and what we did was kind of directed by me, and she had to learn to come along with that. And I really like what your guest has to say today. I think we've just done things so backwards, and I'm a baby boomer. I don't know how we got so backwards with this, but
okay. Thanks very much, Sharon. Dr. Epstein, a thought on that?
Well, Sharon, I think what you're saying, you didn't say much about the details, but I think what you're saying is that your daughter grew up with some real responsibility and a lot of very serious contact with you, much more so than she might have had, let's say, in some other household. And yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm saying everything you can do as a parent to limit peer contact and create more contact with responsible adults is going to help. And there are limits on what you can do, but sometimes you have to get creative, and it sounds like you were creative.
Dr. Epstein, I mean, I don't know if I buy the broad brush of this, because I'm thinking about my friends, the way they're raising their kids. I think I could walk out into the newsroom and talk to people who all had some pretty different upbringings. We all ended up being responsible people who come to work every single day and didn't end up in... I think the evidence is out there that while there are some families who are struggling with their young people who are going through their teens, that it just does not seem... The results don't seem as dire as what you're saying this morning.
No. The results are dire. You're seeing the success stories. You're not seeing the failures. I mean, overall in this country, we have a 30% dropout rate from high school. Among minorities, it's close to 50%.
I guess I would lay that more at the door of the education system and what goes on in the home.
We have 1 in 4 teen females now has a sexually transmitted disease. According to the latest figures from the Department of Education, only 1 in 3 graduating high school seniors is minimally competent in English, and only 1 in 4 is minimally competent in mathematics.
And spending more time with adults would solve that.
Responsible adults away from peers is critical. It's the biggest factor there is in ending teen turmoil.
What do you think the right balance is?
Well, it's hard to answer that question. I mean, the question, the way that people usually pose the question, they say, what about socialization? Isn't high school or middle school, aren't they important for socialization? The answer is no, absolutely not. Proper socialization involves socializing with people across the entire age range, not being stuck with people exactly your own age, almost 24 hours a day. That's not proper socialization. So the most important contact after puberty is with responsible adults. By far, that is the most important kind of contact there is.
Let me take a break for news. When we come back, more of your calls and your questions. Dr. Robert Epstein is with us this morning, former editor-in-chief of Psychology. Today has a book coming out about teens called Teens 2.0, working on another book for parents, bringing out the adult in your child. So we'll talk about that. 800-242-2828 to join us this morning. 651-227-6000. Online, mprnewsq.org. Click on Send Us a Question. Back in a minute.
Programming is supported by Luther Seminary's workingpreacher.org. Resources for preachers by preachers from across the country. workingpreacher.org. Luther Seminary, preparing leaders for mission in God's world.
On the next All Things Considered, turning soybeans into couches. Cargill has developed a process for making beans into the foam for cushions. I'm Tom Cran. Details on that story and all the day's news starting weekdays at 3 on Minnesota Public Radio News.
From Minnesota Public Radio News, I'm Phil Picardi. The Senate Finance Committee meets this morning and is expected to pass a 10-year, $892 billion plan to remake the nation's health care system. The measure would require nearly all Americans to buy health insurance and includes a host of other changes. Yesterday, the health insurance industry released a report arguing the bill would cause hefty increases in premiums. Afghan President Hamid Karzai acknowledges irregularities in the August presidential election, but he told ABC's Good Morning America the vote was worthy of praise, not scorn, and international criticism is making him angry. Karzai also says he's fully behind the U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal. Pakistani jets have been bombing targets in the insurgent stronghold where it says most militant attacks in the country are being planned. Authorities say a separate operation in the northwest has killed 26 insurgents today. Russia's foreign minister says the threat of sanctions against Iran would be counterproductive. Sergei Lavrov made the comments after meeting with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She was expected to push for Moscow's agreement on new measures if Iran fails to prove its nuclear program is peaceful. Clinton says Washington agrees it's important to pursue diplomacy with Iran first. A St. Paul hospital has called in extra staff and opened more treatment space to deal with suspected flu cases. On Sunday, Children's Hospitals and Clinics of Minnesota had 195 patients come through its emergency department. That's the second highest patient volume Children's has recorded at its St. Paul campus. About half of the patients had flu symptoms. Becoming mostly cloudy across the state today, scattered snow flurries in the north, highs in the mid-30s to the low 40s. Right now in the Twin Cities, cloudy to partly sunny, 30 degrees. This is Minnesota Public Radio News.
We're back on Mid-Morning on Minnesota Public Radio. I'm Carrie Miller. Coming up at 10, Karen Armstrong is with us. She is out with a new book called The Case for God. We'll talk about that. Interesting read. But I also want to talk about this project that has really picked up momentum. It's her Compassion Project. They are about to unveil the charter for it about a month from this week. So we're going to talk about that as well. And talk about her belief that religious thinking is not really highly developed. So all of that when Karen Armstrong joins us today at 10. Tomorrow at 10, the Relic Hunter is in the studio with us. Ian Grant, based here in the Twin Cities, about to debut a new show on the Travel Channel, travels the world looking for, well, interesting relics, sustainably produced products, and gets himself into some very interesting scrapes, including witnessing a secret voodoo ceremony and shooting the rapids on the Amazon. So the Relic Hunter here tomorrow at 10. Karen Armstrong with us at 10 o'clock today. Listen for that. Back to our conversation. Dr. Robert Epstein is with us today, visiting scholar at the University of California, San Diego, and the author of a number of books. And Doctor, I'm going to go right back to the phones here because we have a lot of people waiting, to David in St. Paul. Hi, David. You're on Mid-Morning.
Hi, Carrie. Hi, Dr. Epstein. Thank you for taking my call.
Hi, David. That's my middle name.
A really interesting topic. Dr. Epstein, I want to say that I really agree with a lot of stuff you're bringing up. I am a grad student in psychology, and I agree, especially since I started school, there are significant cultural issues in our society that really have a profound negative effect on teens. I would say there have been a couple other things that you've said that I also really disagree with, and I'll just take one of them. You're talking about medications and that they basically, make the pharmaceutical companies rich, which I agree with. But I also think that we know, and you know far more than I, that there are things that cause depression. There are things that, teens need a support system. Everyone needs a support system. There are all kinds of things when we have teens are being forced more and more by the media to feel that there's only a very narrow range of ideas or appearances that are socially acceptable, and if you're not like this, it's bad, and blah, 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 and we see those reinforced in TV and within other kids in high school. I think that's when the problem is taking place. If kids, and one of the things that's really amazing, I think, about Minnesota and probably other
Can I interrupt you for a second, David? Because they're not kids, not past puberty.
Right,
okay, when a goat reaches puberty, it's no longer a kid, it's a goat.
Okay, well, but I think that's kind of, splitting hairs. But anyway, I think that there's some really great schools in Minnesota and in other places where their parents and teachers are working together, and I think that's great. You've got small schools. You have fewer cases where a kid who wants to talk to their teacher has to spend 2 weeks trying to schedule a meeting, because the charter schools and public schools are just really amazing places where they've kind of sat down, like, how can we create a community where it's not just we send the kids off to school. But I think it is really dangerous to say that people shouldn't be on meds, because anxiety and depression are things that can really easily be treated. There are a lot of really awful mental diseases that are much more difficult to be treated, and I don't believe that people should be treated solely with medication. I think that, especially depending on what issues they have, but I think that medication does help profoundly.
David, stay with me for a minute while Dr. Epstein responds to that, and then we'll get your thoughts about what he says.
Well, the whole issue of treatment here, is that's a big part of the problem. The fact that we even think of treating something that in fact is socially caused, that's not actually a disease. Are we talking about depression? Yeah,
you don't believe that there is any physiological or neurological reason for depression?
Well, the vast majority of our teens who are depressed, they're not depressed because of some endemic problem. They're depressed because they are infantilized. They're depressed because they live ridiculous lives, in which they feel like they have no control over their lives, and that's the main reason they're depressed.
Do you think that's also true of adults? I mean, we have a lot of depression among adults. Some
depression among adults is that kind of depression
because they lead ridiculous lives, or because
in which we feel like we have no control. Some depression in adults works that way too. But for the vast majority of our teens, again, you just have to look at other cultures. If you look at other cultures, you'll find many cultures around the world in which there is zero teen depression. We're not talking like 1 or 2%. We're talking about zero. So, the problem is that we look at these problems among our teens and we want to think immediately in terms of pathologizing them, putting a pathological label on, rather than saying, where does this come from? And I'm saying that's what I've been able to do now, which is eye-opening for me. I've been able to say, wait a minute, I think I know where this comes from. And if we treated our young people very differently, my guess is we would see very, very little depression.
Let me go back to David. David?
Okay, well, I guess my response would be I don't think there's research that determines that teenagers get depression because they're infanticized. Also, there are diseases in other cultures, mental diseases, that we don't have in the United States because of cultural differences. And I think that depression is, as far as we're concerned, is based on symptoms, not based on causes.
David,
and it's treated based on people having symptoms.
Good to have your call.
Much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for listening in and sharing your perspective with us. During the break, we talked about your ideas about apprenticeship. You're saying devise a new system, a modern idea of apprenticeship. How would it look?
Well, one of the reasons why we're in the pickle we're in is because when industrialization started to occur in the U.S., which is late 1800s, early 1900s, the old apprentice system disappeared almost overnight, and that was the main way in which teens were working side by side with adults and had been for probably thousands of years. Now, we can't go back to, that kind of, system, where we shoe horses together and so on. But, work by Csikszentmihalyi and others suggests that, in fact, teens very easily could be working side by side with almost anyone, with nuclear physicists, with physicians, with lawyers. You know why? Because they learn so very quickly. Speaking of the brain, here's something about the brain that is quite fascinating. Brain size peaks at age 14.
Yeah, I was
That's
reading that in the research.
White and gray matter both. It starts to shrink in our 20s or so, and by the time we are 70, think Supreme Court justices, it has shrunk to the size it was when we were between 2 and 3 years old. It's lost 25% of its mass, and that's both white and gray matter.
Come back to the apprenticeship, though. Don't get off on that, because that's interesting. I imagine when I hear educators, when we've had discussions on the show about what's happening you're talking about other cultures, what's happening in other cultures around the world when it comes to science and math and knowledge, and what's going on in American schools, I cannot see many educators say, yes, let's spend part of the day taking kids out of school, taking young people out of school, sending them to the office of a lawyer, because, hey, they'll get the skills that they need to compete in the global economy.
Yeah, but I did that at age 16. I worked with a lawyer, and he said I was the smartest assistant he'd ever had. So, I think we're wrong there. I do competency testing with teens and adults, and I have new data, which I presented at a convention in May with more than 30,000 people between ages 10 and 83. My data suggest that 30% of our teens under 18 are more competent than half of our adults. That's 7 million teens more competent than half of our adults. That is, they score above the median for adults across a wide range of competencies.
What's wrong then with the idea of, for those teens who are clearly accelerating on the educational path, what's wrong with giving them more educational challenges instead of, sending them out into some law office where they, sit there? I don't even know what you did when you were 16 years old, but was it more important than the things you could have been learning?
Oh, well, it was meaningful. It was meaningful. What I was doing in school was not meaningful. Most of it was ridiculous.
Isn't that a problem with the school?
Memorizing Chaucer? I mean, really, give me a break.
Wait a minute. You're coming to my show now to say that Chaucer is not important?
Juan that April with the Shura Sota.
I consider that class in college one of the most important that I took, Dr. Epstein. I got to tell you that.
The point is, though, we treat all young people as if they're equally incompetent, irresponsible, needing our protection and needing our guidance about what to learn and whether or not to work. And the fact is they're not all the same. We recognize this for anyone who's in his or her 20s or 30s or 40s. We know they're all very, very different one from another. Well, you know what? That's true for teens too. But we treat them all the same. It just doesn't make any sense.
Let me go back to the phones here to Chad in Minneapolis. Hi, Chad. Thanks very much for waiting.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Of course. Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment earlier with what he had said about the responsible adults in a child's life. I think that is a huge point, because as parents, you can only do so much. You need to have a wide diversity of responsible adult interaction to learn what other people can do and to learn other aspects of life. For example, in the schools, you've got your chess programs, your art programs, your athletic programs, smaller groups where you can get that one-on-one time with an adult. And I think that's a very, very important part that the education system needs to get back to is the smaller class sizes. He was commenting about a middle school teacher with 200 kids. That teacher isn't going to get to know every child. And so to get more opportunities with those adults, I think that's the important part that I agree with him about.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Epstein?
Well, I'm actually here in Minnesota because I'm with a group called Education Evolving. They brought me here. Thank you very much for bringing me here today. And this is a group that is looking at the future of education in Minnesota and elsewhere. And that's exactly what they're talking about. And they've brought in all kinds of folks from around the country to talk about those issues because the factory school system just doesn't make sense.
But I don't think anybody is here to say, yes, larger class sizes, that's the answer. Mm-hmm. Nobody. I haven't heard anybody on this show say that in a long time.
But we have to actually move in the extreme opposite direction. We have to recognize that all real learning has to be individualized, has to be personalized, and that can be done. Now the question is, how do we take resources from the school, plus all the new technology that's emerging so rapidly, and create something new? And I think we can. That's one area of society where I see the change starting, and I see people starting to think about these things. And again, I watch my 4-year-old in the kitchen learning to read rapidly from a computer, and I say, this is it. Something huge is going to happen. So that I think is going to happen. But there are other areas where I think we have larger problems. One is the work area, because if you look at the history of our labor laws, and especially the so-called child labor laws, we've got a big problem there. Because what happened was that the unions pushed young people out of the workforce. Now, at first, they were pushing young people just out of the dangerous jobs working in coal mines and that kind of thing. But over a period of years, they pushed young people out of all work. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Again, work gives meaning to life. Work makes you a contributor to your family, to your society.
Isn't there plenty of time to work after age 22? The rest of your life is going to be spent working. Why do you have to start work at 14, 15 years old?
You have to start work when you're ready to start work. And you should be in a school learning something when you're ready to learn. Readiness is important. Very, very famous educator, German educator named Kurt Hahn, he said the problem with our schools is that we're trying to fill a jug with water without first making sure that the lid is off. And that readiness is very important for many kinds of things in life. And the fact is there are a lot of young people who, for a certain period of time, are far better off working, learning to become adults, working side by side with adults, rather than sitting in a classroom.
Let me go to the phones to Bob in St. Paul. Bob, you're a teacher?
Hey, thanks. Yes, I'm a licensed social studies teacher, and one of the things that I always thought was just a huge disconnect, and I think is schools contributing to the infantilicizing of kids, is that it's virtually the only institution where the people who are the object of the service or product have virtually no say and are not consulted about what happens to them.
That's an excellent point, and I have to say that teachers have been my strongest supporters because teachers, they have all of those faces, right there, right in front of them. They know. I call it the elephant in the classroom. They know how different one young person is from the next, and they know that how frustrating it can be that I can't really work with all these people as individuals, and I'm kind of losing the top third because I have to hold them back. I'm losing the lower third because they don't know what I'm talking about. Teachers know how important these issues are.
I wondered if this book, Guyland, came across your desk last summer when it was published. Have you heard about it or seen it? It's written by a Stony Brook professor who says in the book that men, to a large degree, are extending their adolescence and that the culture really supports that. He says that many of the milestones of life, being married, finding a fulfilling job, having a family, are being delayed by men who just really are not interested in the idea of adulthood, and that we live in this culture that really celebrates that. You think that's right?
Yes, basically. In fact, the latest survey data suggests that adulthood now begins at age 26 in this country. 26. and that's no coincidence. That's also about the median age for first marriage.
I was going to say, so as measured, how do you think we should measure the idea of adulthood, though?
Well, I actually set out to do that with a doctoral student of mine named Diane Dumas. And if you go to howadultareyou.com, you can actually take a survey that measures adult competencies. And so we spent years trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to be an adult in terms of, actual abilities and competencies? And, I've been looking at data now from tens of thousands of people who've taken the test, and it's fascinating. All I can say is it's not what you think. That's all I can say, because there are teens who are every bit as competent and mature as adults are, and there are people at 50 years old who are as incompetent as the most incompetent teen.
So what do you think drives it?
What drives it? Well,
who emerges as an adult earlier than others?
I think it's, the usual answer. There's genes probably play a big role, and then, of course, your experiences play a big role, too. One of the things that's interesting about this is that as people get older, the incompetent get fewer. There are fewer incompetent people. Now, why is that? Well, you could say some of them get institutionalized. They're in jail, or they're in, mental health facilities, or they're dead. Because if you don't know that mixing drugs and alcohol is extremely dangerous, and you still don't know that
by
at
the
age
time
40,
you're
dead. So in fact, people do get a little more competent as they get older, but I think it's through a kind of Darwinian selection process.
Online here from Jeff in Maple Grove, who asks, could the disconnect from parent-child relationships come from the fact that Americans work more hours here than in other places?
Absolutely. And it's not just that we work more hours, but we have, if it's a two-parent home, we have mom and dad working very commonly. And of course, we have more single-parent homes than any other country in the world.
What's the research? I mean, we heard from a single parent who said that her daughter basically had to take on early responsibilities. She thought that made her more mature. What's the research on that?
Oh, no question about that. I have a whole chapter on that very issue. And if young people take on responsibility early, they end up much better off, much more mature, far fewer problems.
How does that manifest? I mean, we talking chores? What do we really mean?
Not chores. Responsibility, just set aside this notion that young people are different. Forget that, because they're different and they're the same. And again, some are actually superior to us in some respects, or at least are equals in very, very important respects. So set aside young versus old and just think about what responsibility is for an adult. What is it? Well, we all have to do chores, but that's not a big part of it. What we mean by responsibility is something that's important to do. In other words, that has meaning for us.
What would that be?
Well, for some of it, for most of us, it means going and talking on the radio.
Well,
or
yeah,
something.
but let's say in a household, we've got parents listening this morning who might say, I buy this, I want to give my young person, meaningful responsibility.
Right.
How do I do that?
Well, that means, again, it depends on your situation, but it means thinking like an adult and bringing your young daughters and sons, bringing them into adulthood in meaningful ways. What does that mean? That means handling money. That means opening up bank accounts. That means having them assist you. I mean, my 11-year-old assists me doing, audio editing and things like that. Doing some of the online things that I have to do, or book indexing or things like that. My 9-year-old helps me do things like that. So I try to get them part of what I do, the real things that I do. And that means infinitely more to them than, taking out the garbage.
How many children do you have, by the way? You keep mentioning all these different ages.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I have 6 children.
From the ages of?
I have 4 children and 2 stepchildren. They range in age from 3 to 30.
Wow. Okay.
And I adore all of them. I love kids.
From Linda in Minneapolis online, she says, connecting with their peers seems so important to my teens. What do you think about Facebook use every day after school?
Well, that's the problem. That's what I'm saying. That's where the 70 hours comes from in the survey research. That's why, it's partly through mechanisms like Facebook and texting. The teens are in touch with each other on average 70 hours a week. And I'm saying that's a really bad thing. On average, teens in this country are in conflict with their parents 20 times a month. Now, that's the average. So think about that.
And we would define conflict as we disagree about what time I should be home? Or
no,
conflict
conflict is more serious. Conflict means
an argument that's gone on.
Yeah. Okay. Conflict is a serious thing that causes pain. So, as I say, that contact with peers is a big problem.
Online from Susie, at what age do I start limiting my children's exposure to their peers?
Okay, it's hard to answer that question because it implies that you want to exercise control. So, we're walking a tightrope here because I'm saying we do want to limit contact with peers. We want to create wonderful new opportunities for meaningful contact with responsible adults, but somehow we have to do this without becoming the enemy.
And I guess that's a great ad for reading your book, isn't it?
Exactly.
And Teens 2.0 comes out in the spring. In the meantime, if you'd like a little preview of it, you can go online to teen20.com. Is that right?
Teen20.com, yeah.
Okay. And howadultareyou.com as well. Dr. Epstein, good to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Carrie.
Coming up at 10 o'clock, we talk with religious scholar and author Karen Armstrong about her new book, The Case for God. I'm really interested in the Compassion Project that she's working on. They unveil their charter, I bet this time next month. And we're going to talk about why she believes that so much of religious thinking is underdeveloped. Karen Armstrong with us for the hour at 10. I will mention this. She has recently contributed to a piece that the Wall Street Journal set up asking Karen Armstrong and Richard Dawkins for where evolution leaves God. We'll talk with Karen Armstrong about what she thought about it, and Richard Dawkins is going to be on the show next week, so we will talk with him about that as well. Some good listening coming up. Stay tuned with us at 10 o'clock. This is Mid-Morning.
Each weekday, Minnesota Public Radio News invites you to join the conversation on mprnewsq.org. Today's question: what should happen with the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy? Share your answer. Go to mprnewsq.org.
From Jason, who says, I have several gay friends who put their life on the line for our country by serving in our military. They risk more than the average soldier does. They risk life and limb and their retirement, financial well-being if they were ever kicked out. Honor them, don't dishonor them, and repeal it. You can weigh in at mprnewsq.org.
What are you doing this weekend?
I'm going to teach New Yorkers to love walleye.
We're hanging out with friends?
I never asked to be a Baptist dog. Just because I'm a shepherd, they thought I was Baptist.
Telling a few jokes?
I'm the guy who, when the grasshopper walked in, I said, we've got a drink named after you. And
Sure.
he said, well, why would anyone name a drink Bob? I don't get that.
And looking around for you. Join us.
Listen to A Prairie Home Companion Saturday nights at 5 and Sunday mornings at 11 on Minnesota Public Radio News.